In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make this procedural concrete material with Blender shader nodes. With this node setup, you'll be able to change the appearance of the holes and cracks on the fly, as well as have access to the respective masks in case you want to layer any additional effects on them. Throughout the video, I'll be explaining why I make certain decisions and what I'm trying to achieve with each node that I add. This particular tutorial doesn't involve very much math, as we're going to be doing most things visually. Let's get started by adding a UV sphere, shading it smooth, and adding a couple levels of subdivision to give ourselves a nice object to build a procedural material on. I'll switch over to cycles and turn off the scene's world lighting to use Blender's default HDRI so I can get an idea of what the material looks like when it's lit without having to do a full lighting setup. I will, however, add an area light up top and increase the power so we have a section that's a little more contrasted than the others. As you follow along, I encourage you to pause every so often to observe the progress we made by looking at it from different angles and lighting conditions, as well as trying out different values for the nodes. I'm jumping straight from one thing to the next because I'm trying to keep this tutorial brief, but you should absolutely take your time and experiment because not only will that help you gain a better understanding of the setup, you might discover better settings than the ones I used. Anyway, I'll create a new material and add a texture coordinate node. This procedural concrete doesn't require any sort of 2D calculations or transformations, so we're free to use the object coordinates to operate in 3D space. This means that this material can be dropped into a model without needing to UV unwrap it first. Add a vector math node set to scale. Any node that requires a vector input should use the scale node's output so we have a single control that we can use to universally scale our material. All of the surface detail in this material is done via a bump node. So let's work on creating a height map for it, starting with the holes. The holes we're making are going to be small divots, which will work well with a bump map as opposed to large gouges that require displacement to look correct. One way to achieve this is to start with a factor output of a noise texture. I'll set it to 4D to give me access to the W value, which will allow me to generate different variations of the texture. This comes in handy when we want to layer multiple noise textures together while avoiding overlap, and we can use it as a node group input to change the distribution of the holes on the fly. If I increase the scale and roughness, you can see repeating blotches that are evenly dispersed and round in nature. In a height map, the dark areas represent low points, while light areas represent high ones, so I want to find a way to isolate some of these dark blotches. In Blender, colors also represent numbers, with black being 0 and below, 1 being white and above, and gray being everything in between. With that in mind, I can take the noise and plug it into a greater than node. By lowering the threshold, I can isolate the lower values, which are the darker areas of the noise texture. This, however, outputs an image that only contains zeros and ones. If I want my holes to have a smoother transition from the surface to a low point, I need to bring back the original gradient from the noise texture. To do that, I'll use a mix color node and mix the original noise texture with pure white, using the greater than output as the factor. The gradients that we have now all contain similar levels of gray since we isolated the range. That means these holes are going to appear relatively flat. To increase the depth between the high and low points, I'll increase the contrast with the brightness contrast node. I now want a way to manipulate the gradients to control the appearance of the holes, and for that, I'll use a map range node set to smooth step. If you haven't used this before, it functions similar to a color ramp that only has black and white flags, but instead of using these sliders, you have access to numerical values. The from min will make the dark areas darker from the center out, and the from max will make the light areas lighter from the outside in. In other words, you can think of the from min as adjusting the depth of the hole from the center up to the outer edge, and the from max as adjusting the width of the hole by changing the size of the edge. Be careful that you don't accidentally invert the ranges because that will invert the texture, and your concrete will end up with pimples instead of holes. Since we're working with small numbers here, you can hold down Shift while dragging your cursor around to change the numbers in smaller increments to make it easier to control. If you find that the jumps are still too big, you can multiply their inputs by a smaller number, like 0.5, and that will slow down the rate of change even more. Now, the reason I use smooth step instead of linear is because it gives the fall off more of a rounded look. In the grand scheme of things, this likely won't make a big difference, especially when the concrete is viewed from a distance, but I like the way it looks, so I'm going to use this for all my map range nodes in this video. With all of these adjustments, we've washed out a good amount of the texture we started with, and as we continue to add details, more will be wiped out. To compensate for this, I'm going to add another layer of holes by duplicating the noise texture we already have and changing the W value. Since I'm going to have these W values accessible outside the node group as a single input, I can guarantee that these two textures won't end up with the same value by adding something before one of them. I'll combine the two noise textures with the mixed color nodes set to darken and the factor turned up to 1. If you don't know what darken does, it combines the two layers by keeping the darker color wherever there's a difference in the overlap. If you want, you could use multiply instead, but that ends up messing with the scaling of the gradient as all the values are driven closer to 0. Multiply, as its name implies, multiplies the values of the two layers together to combine them, and in this case, you'll always end up with a darker image because two numbers between 0 and 1 multiplied together will always result in a smaller number. You could account for this scaling change and achieve decent results, but that means you'll have to use even smaller numbers for your inputs than we already are, which makes it harder to make fine-tuned adjustments. Anyway, use this newly combined texture as the input for the greater than and mixed color nodes, and that will wrap up our work on the holes and we can move on to the cracks. For the cracks, we'll use a 4D Voronoi texture set to distance the edge as our base. This algorithm generates random lines that run all over our object, which serves as a good starting point. We just need to make a few adjustments. The first thing I'm going to do is feed this into a map range node to get some control over the way these lines look. Just like with the holes, the from max controls the gradient fall off, which will adjust the size of the cracks. However, we're going to need really small numbers to get tight lines, so I'm going to multiply the input by 0.1 so I stay within the relevant range while dragging the slider around. Unlike the holes, however, we're going to use a to-min to control the depth instead of the from-min for two reasons. First, the from max value is so small that you can't adjust your from-min very much before you invert the values. Second, the from-min controls the depth from the center out. As this value approaches the from max value, the walls of the cracks get steeper, so instead of having a V-shaped crack, you end up with a rectangular gouge. If that's the effect you're going for, then this is the way to do it. But because I want the V-shape, I'm going to use the to-min to control depth instead. The to-min adjusts the depth uniformly by changing the brightness of the entire gradient, which makes the whole thing go up and down, so you always maintain the V-shape, as opposed to the from-min, which works from the darkest points outward. Next, I want a way to add some distortion so these aren't all straight lines. To do that, I'll use a mixed color node set to linear light, and I'll combine our texture coordinates with a color output from a noise texture. The reason why we're using linear light is because in the background, it conveniently does the offset math we need so that the distortions average out to 0, which won't shift our base coordinates around too much. Compare that to something like mix, where all semblance of our original coordinates can get lost. Anyway, right off the bat, you can see the noise distorting our texture coordinates, and if we plug this into the vector input of the Voronoi texture, you can see the effect it has on our lines. We now have three controls to work with. First is the factor, which controls the blend between the texture coordinates and the noise texture. I'm going to set this to a low value like 0.1 so that our base coordinates aren't shifted around too much. Second is the noise scale, which you can use to control the general shape of the distortion. The larger the scale, the more curves our lines will have. Third is the detail, which will add more definition within the curves themselves without changing the overall shape. As a side note, try to avoid excessively high detail values because the larger this number is, the longer your render times will be since Blender has to do additional calculations for every level of detail. Don't max this out at 15 if you don't have a good reason to. In general, I have a very hard time seeing any difference in the image once the detail gets to about 6 or 8. Our cracks are now looking pretty good. We just need a way to mask out sections of it so the lines aren't continuous and the Voronoi pattern isn't as obvious. Once again, we'll rely on our good friend the noise texture, set to 4D, to create a mask that will cover up random sections of the cracks. I'll hook this up to a mixed color node set to color burn and combine it with pure black. The factor of the color burn will push black out from the dark areas of the gradient, allowing us to control the size of the mask. When the factor is set at 1, the output is completely black. However, when the factor is at 0, the output isn't completely white. We want our output to be uniform in color at either extreme so that we have the ability to completely enable or disable the mask if we wanted to. So if we take a look at the noise texture, something you might notice is that when it's normalized, the output doesn't cover the full range from 0 to 1. With our current settings, the values range from about 0.2 to 0.8. You can check these values by using a greater than or less than node and playing around with the thresholds. So if we take the lowest visible value, which is 0.2 in this case, and plug that into a from max of a map range node, anything that was greater than that value will be cut off and remapped into this uniform white. To be safe, I'm going to lower the from max to 0.1 since I've run into cases where the lowest value was below 0.2. Now, as we increase the factor of our color burn, parts of the gradient will be pushed below the from max value, allowing the mask to reappear. We can then use this as a factor with the mixed color node and mix the crack texture with white to get our masked out cracks. From there, multiply the hole and crack textures together with a factor set to 1 to combine them. If you're curious why I use multiply here instead of darken, it's because sometimes the edges of these two gradients will be up against each other and this ridge will form. I think it's because the underlying area isn't very dark and the rate of change for the gradients of the cracks and holes don't match, so they don't blend very well. Multiply offers a smoother result in this case because whenever there is overlap, the blend mode will result in a darker color, making it look like one chipped away into the other. Concrete can be colored in all sorts of different ways. The one I'm going for will have patches that are slightly lighter or darker than the surrounding area. We'll once again use a noise texture, and I'll feed the factor into a color ramp. The colors on the left side of the color ramp correspond to the dark areas of the noise texture. The colors on the right side correspond to the light areas, and the middle are all the grays in between. Set as many stops as you like, and pick whatever colors you think look good. I'm keeping it simple with just 3 stops and 3 shades of gray. Again, when the noise texture is normalized, it isn't outputting values in the full range of 0 to 1. With my current settings, the output goes from about 0.2 to 0.8. This results in a low amount of contrast, which affects the color output of the color ramp, since it isn't taking advantage of the full range. To account for this, you can scrunch up the flags in the color ramp, but that makes it harder to make fine-tuned adjustments, especially if you decide to use more colors. What I'm going to do instead is uncheck normalize in the noise texture, which expands the output range and gives me the contrast I'm looking for. Speaking of contrast, I want to color the cracks and holes to add additional detail and make them stand out a little bit more. I'll use another color ramp for this with our crack and hole mask as the factor, and I'll use a reddish brown color to make it look like there's a bit of dirt and dust accumulation in the crevices. Since the dark parts of the mask represent the deepest areas, the left side of the color ramp will get the dirt color and the right side will be set to white. I'll also cinch up the right side flag to decrease the gradient spread since I only want this additional color to be in the deepest part of the crevices. The reason why we set the rest of this color ramp to white is so we can multiply it with the concrete color ramp to layer the two color maps onto each other. Now the cracks and holes will be darker with a different color while still maintaining the underlying concrete color pattern. The overall appearance of this concrete is too smooth, and the holes don't blend in very naturally, so I'll fix that by adding in some additional detail across the entire surface. I'll use a noise texture that's scaled up really high. To make it easier to get to different meaningful numbers, I'll multiply the input value of this by 10. To combine the additional surface detail with the cracks and holes, I'll use a mixed color node set to multiply with the factor at 1. Using multiply allows a smaller surface detail to be overlaid on top of the cracks and holes, giving us a texture that covers our whole object and helps blend the transition between the unbroken surface and the cracks and holes. We can also use this newly combined map with the surface detail to create a roughness map. When it comes to roughness maps, black is glossy and reflective, white is the opposite, and gray is something in between. As is, our combined map indicates that the cracks and holes are shiny, which doesn't make sense to me since I imagine the surface breaks in the concrete won't be smooth and polished. To fix this, we'll start by inverting the colors with an invert color node. This fixes the issue of having reflective cracks and holes, but I feel like the rest of the roughness map still has too many glossy spots. A quick fix to this is to use a brightness contrast node to raise the overall brightness level of the map to make everything uniformly more rough. And with that, we've completed our procedural concrete material. There are many factors that we can control, so it's up to you what inputs you want to make accessible if you're packaging this into a node group. There are plenty of options, but these are the ones I chose because I thought they'd be the most commonly used. If you end up using this material in one of your projects, tag me in it because I would love to see it. My socials are in the description.